My name is Andy Bowen, and I am the social policy organizer for DC Trans Coalition. My campaign tends to revolve around policy issues, so I work on housing, healthcare, employment, and also name change documents, so a wide array. We do fight for transgender people's access to resources, right? To make sure that everybody has what they need to thrive. And we try to do so in a way that's conscious of the different race, class, gender barriers, across the community. The first thing I started working with the group on was a birth certificate and name change bill, which was just introduced in DC Council on February 19th. And so what that would do is, if you want to get your name changed and your birth certificate gender marker changed in DC, it's kind of complicated, right? Like, first you have to get surgery, right, which costs upwards of $10,000. So, and then you have to furnish proof of your surgery to a judge, and then the judge gives you a court order saying you can have your gender marker on your birth certificate changed. So, like, I wasn't born in DC, but so I'll just still use me as an example. So I was assigned male at birth, and so if I wanted to change to female, I'd have to have surgery, right? And so that's a barrier to a lot of people. If you look at DC's transgender community, where it's primarily low-income people of color. Access to surgery is like not even I have significantly more resources than I would say the cross-section of DC's trans community. I can't access surgery, right? So it's just like not even a question. So that's a problem. And then if you get your birth certificate changed, you only get, it's amended, so there's like a little stamp in the right-hand corner, so anyone who sees it knows your history, so you're outed. And then if you want to get your name changed, you have to publish notice of it in a newspaper for 3 weeks, which means suddenly you're Googleable. So if I'm changing my name, I'm Andrew Bowen, legally, but I want to change it to Andrea Bowen, but then my name is published in a newspaper for 3 weeks. Andrew Bowen is changing her name to Andrea Bowen or whatever. So that outs me too. So it's kind of a boring but important thing, right? Because like, if you want to live life, a lot of our life is administrative law, which is a boring subject, but is really important to making sure we get what we need. And so we're trying to change that so people can get all their identity documents in line. So we do it so you don't need surgery anymore. You just get like an affidavit from some sort of medical provider saying you've had treatment appropriate to your transition. Doesn't have to be anything surgical, doesn't have to be anything like involving medication. Sometimes people take hormones, I take hormones, right? Like I take estrogen to make sure that I look more female. And so, but some people can't even do that, right? Because like they have health problems. Sometimes like what you can do is we call it a social transition, where, you just sort of like take on the appearance of another gender. And then, you live and act accordingly, and that might not necessarily involve physiological changes. So we're trying to make it so, like, even if you have a social transition, like, you can still get your gender marker changed. And we're trying to make it so you get a brand new birth certificate, right? So that if you see it, like, you're not outed. And then we're trying to make sure that you don't have to publish your name in a newspaper anymore. You don't have to publish your name at all. So that bill was introduced in DC Council. It's named after Deone Jones, who was a transgender woman who was killed last year at a bus stop on East Capitol Street. And it was introduced with unanimous DC Council support, which is pretty cool. So that's the primary thing I've worked on. And am I talking too long? No. Okay. Then the other aspect of what I'm working on, so from working on that, like, that's an important issue, but when you're working on community building, as I was working on this and trying to get, seeing how people felt about it, seeing if I could get people to like go visit council members. DC's trans community has had some really serious survival needs, right? So we're looking at, a homeless population, people who don't have shelter, or if they do have shelter, they face barriers in having safety there, right? So like, people may try to access a shelter, but because of discrimination against trans people, because people are bigoted, etc., they'll harass people, right? So you go into a shelter and people will harass you because you don't, fit their bill of what a woman looks like, or you don't look like what a man looks like, or whatever. I just actually talked to a shelter this week that it's a women's shelter that forces transgender women to provide evidence, documentary evidence of their womanhood, right? Which is illegal, but they've been doing it. I don't know how long they've been doing it, right? And so, like, we have to make sure that people have safe places to stay. That's, like, absolutely primary. Healthcare is another huge concern. Healthcare access is just, both in terms of, like, getting the kinds of treatments that you need in order to transition, also in terms of making sure that, so if you're transitioning and you were started off your life living as a woman and now you're transitioning to a male, right? You're taking testosterone to transition. Your ovaries become a mess, right? And like that can become like a very serious health threat to people. So like a lot of transgender men, right? That's the term that a lot of people use. Transgender men, they want hysterectomies, but those aren't covered by health insurance generally, because they're covered for like people whose gender marker says F, female, but they're not covered if your gender marker says M. So making sure that like healthcare covers that procedure, making sure people can get hormones, making sure people can get surgeries, making sure people can get like just a ton of things covered. I had a friend who is a transgender man, and he had a mastectomy, which is a removal of the breasts. And because that's not covered by his insurance, he went to an outpatient center, so he goes in, he gets the procedure done, and he leaves. Most people who get a double mastectomy period are in a hospital, right? It's an inpatient procedure. My friend leaves this place and gets an infection, and then the infection goes septic. So I got a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning. Andy, I really need to go to the emergency room. And it was just sort of waiting by his bedside for 48 hours until his mom showed up from Oregon to sort of take over. And so after that happened, it was like, no, we can't, this has to get covered by insurance, right? Like, I don't want people in this situation. So healthcare is another huge issue. And then also employment. I mean, transgender unemployment rates are just through the roof. I mobilized people, and I'm trying to mobilize people, it's an ongoing process, by trying to be really conscious of who is involved in policy advocacy. Because, like I said, DC's trans community is primarily low-income people of color. But for a very long time, the vast majority of people doing the policy advocacy, so like going to DC Council and talking with like politicians, have been white people of considerably better economic means. So it seems to me that like to make sure that you're doing, like confronting the issues that are of like this like deep survival need, and also making sure that like you're doing it in a way that meets everybody's needs, like you need to make sure that like the most oppressed people, most marginalized people are doing that policy work. So there are transgender drop-in centers, like clinics. Two of them in the city. One is this place called Transgender Health Empowerment, and another one is called Casa Ruby. So over the summer, I talked to someone who I kind of knew at Transgender Health Empowerment, which primarily caters to African American trans people. And I was just like, we have a problem. It's like the people who are doing like this really important work are primarily white people who are like middle class, upper middle class, and like that's not the way it should be. Like how do we break down these barriers and like make sure that like there's representation in terms of who's talking to council members and who's doing this work. So it started off just by like sort of having like these listening sessions, just sort of like coming in at noon every Friday around lunchtime and just like talking to people who showed up at Transgender Health Empowerment and talking about like, have you ever been involved in like politics? Have you ever been involved in like advocacy? And sometimes it's just like, I had one of my friends who I sort of like organized and who's a very good friend of mine now, like she was like, yeah, one time I told like, some guy like, you know, talk smack to me on the train. So like I told him like to stop. And I'm like, yeah, that's political engagement. That's advocacy. And so it's like connecting that to like the wider world of like, okay, so like now put that on the level of like telling a DC council member. And like, so doing that kind of work, right? And so, and now shifting that to sort of just like focusing on specific issues. Such as like, okay, so like what's our first step? We want to change healthcare, what's step one? And then what are our deadlines and who's getting it done? So I used to work in organized labor. I used to work for the Iron Workers Union. And I looked like a boy when I was doing that. This is before I went full-time as a woman. And so, like, you know, I went around halls. We had, like, a sort of, like, a lobbyist, and we just sort of went from council member office to council member office. And, like, I saw, you know, the lobbyist person doing that. I'm like, this isn't that hard. You just have to show up. DC's especially funny because it's kind of like a small-town government, right? It's only 13 council members. So I just did that. Like, I just go into the John Wilson building, 1350 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest. And, you know, I scheduled some meetings. If people didn't get back to me, I just walked into an office and was like, hi, can I talk to your legislative director? Can I talk to the legislative council? Hi, my name's Andy. I'm from DC Trans Coalition. We're trying to get a bill introduced in DC Council that does X and Y. And so you get the meeting. And then people return calls or they don't. You find out who's like a diehard ally. Kenya McDuffie's office was like on it, right? And they were like, yeah, we want to get this done. And so like they became like a diehard ally and it's like, cool, where should I go? And they gave really good advice. Some people, and then it's just like, I haven't heard from anybody in a while and I need to make my presence known. I just like take Fridays, like Friday morning. I'm in grad school right now, so I have a lot of free time. I pretend I have a lot of free time. I just like will go to DC Council on a Friday morning and just go from office to office. Like, you know, now I've got like people who I know, and I go from office to office and I say like, hi, I'm Mandy. Hey, how's the bill going? Like, have you made a decision on whether or not you're going to co-introduce or co-sponsor? So there's that. Another aspect is also engaging with media, right? I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, right? I friend people who I know. I mean, like, you know, through going to, like, political events, through just, like, I don't know, striking up conversations with people on, like, Twitter. Like, I've made friends with some journalists, right? And then that leads to friends with people who are sort of, like, in, like, that sort of, like, political scene. And I just, you know, I talk to them on Twitter, talk to them elsewhere, and then, like, I find out, like, what events are going on. And then, like, do I have time for an anecdote?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the craziest story is this. So, like, I wound up becoming, basically through, like, Twitter and then a chance meeting at a party, friends with this guy, Brian Weaver, who ran for council and was an advisory neighborhood commissioner. And Weaver, I told him about the work I was trying to get done with this bill, and he was like, with the birth certificate and name change bill, and he's like, so I'm going to have a meet and greet with Phil Mendelson before the election. Phil Mendelson's the council chairman. Well, he was council chairman at the time. He's like, would you like to come and politely harass him? I went, sure. So I show up to this meeting, or to this meet and greet. It's like at a bar in Adams Morgan. And like Mendelsohn shows up and starts answering questions from the audience, and I'm kind of quiet. I didn't exactly know how the whole thing was going to go, but Brian's like, so my friend Andy Bowen from DC Trans Coalition's being kind of shy, but she has a question for the council member. So I said, council member, we're trying to get this bill introduced. Are you familiar with it? He's like, yes. And I'm like, okay, what will it take to get you on board? And he makes this comment. He's like, well, with trans people, this bill, it kind of reminds me of, I'm kind of worried about people changing the facts of their birth. And then that sort of set me off, right? It's like, transgender people, you're not changing the facts. It's trying to make the facts on paper conform to what is real for you. So that set me off, right? And then he also was like, it also kind of reminds me of this ex-offender bill that we have going on right now, which set everybody else in the room off. they're like, what kind of comparison are you making here? So after that interview was over, after he made his comment, I sidled up to him and his aide, and I'm like, can we meet and talk about this in person? And I went over to his aide, just one-on-one, and what he said was really offensive to me. But I'm a pretty nice person, and I don't want to embarrass him in public. So can we meet? And that scared him, right? And so next thing I know, in a week and a half, I have a personal meeting with Phil Mendelsohn. We talked for an hour and a half. And he co-sponsored. He co-introduced. So it's it's a random series of connections. I'd say the primary thing, if you want to get connections to people in council, you just assert yourself. Act like you should be there, right? You don't have to, no one has to give you permission, no one has to do anything. Just be like, I have an issue, I deserve to be here, and go with it. I think I persevered despite challenges by continuing with that mindset, like I said, of I should be here. And also, getting the community involved, right? Community engagement is the most important thing, right? And so it's getting Yvette Alexander. Yvette Alexander is Ward 7 council member. Most trans women who have been murdered are from her ward. So just making sure that I had community members meeting with her and talking with her. So I had 2 trans women from Ward 7 go and have a meeting with her before the bill was introduced. And that sort of got it on her radar, oh, this is a constituent issue. And then after it was introduced, we had some people call her office and ask for a hearing. Because, budget season is coming up. You have to be very mindful of timelines. And so, right, so budget season's coming up. And so the bill's just introduced, budget season, the budget gets introduced at the end of March. And then it's council's just in a frenzy to get that taken care of. So it's well, how do we use community power to make the system work for us? And that's just a matter of, showing up to these drop-in centers, talking with people, having coffee, going to McDonald's, talking with people, just having breakfast with people in the community, forming those relationships. And then when the time comes, being hey, can you call Yvette Alexander's office and tell them this? Right? And emphasizing then when stuff happens and stuff works for you, being hey, by the way, you made Yvette Alexander give us a hearing in the midst of budget season. How cool is that? And that works. The birth certificate and name change bill there's a term that I use called wonky, which means it's kind of obscure, very legalistic. It's important, no questions asked that it's very important. But when you're working with a population that survival is the need, right? Sometimes working on things your gender marker change and name change might not seem the most important issue. So at the same time, that I've been working on this bill, it was also clear that, like, if we want to build community power, and we want to make sure everyone can thrive, then, like, we have to be, like, also getting, like, achievable progress on these issues of survival. And so, as I was working on, like, lobbying for this bill, I was like, we have to start a campaign for, like, the 3 really important issues that have not been, like, deeply addressed by policy advocates: healthcare, housing, and employment. Like, we have to do this. And so that's what I've been trying to get off the ground for the last few months. We just had our 2nd full meeting. Yeah, just, I mean, basically, you have to meet people where they are, right? Like, that's, like, the fundamental rule of advocacy, I think. Meet people where they are. Solicit people's ideas. I think it's important to be prepared and to sort of, like, so when I meet with someone who I think is interested, let me step back. So I was in the waiting room at one of these drop-in centers a couple weeks ago, and I'm talking to this woman who, like, is, like, really seems, like, super engaged and, like, has been working with the center for a while. And I'm like, do you want to get involved in politics? And she's like, yeah, totally. And, like, I give her, like, a brief description of the campaign. and she's interested. And so then I put her on my mailing list, and then, like, then I just call her and follow up with her. So making sure you're doing intense outreach, and then, like, I'm just like, so what ideas do you have? Like, we've got these 3 realms we want to work on: healthcare, housing, and employment. Like, what of those do you feel like is the major focus? She's like, well, I think employment. And I'm like, okay, cool. So, like, we want to make employment work for trans people. Like, how do you make that happen? And she's like, well, you know, I think that we need to, like, put together trainings, but we also need to, like, put out together trainings for, like, employers to let them know about trans people. And I'm like, okay, cool. And it's like, well, now we incorporate that. That becomes part of our employment campaign. So, like, you meet, you know, I'm coming from the position of privilege, right? Like, immense privilege, like class privilege, race privilege. And so if I'm working primarily with people who are much more marginalized than me, it's like, well, like, one, like, my activism has to be guided by community needs. And if we've left, like, these 3 huge things off the table, then we got to go after those. And, like, the only way that we're really going to build community capacity, like, I am not, you know, I'm in grad school, so employment's not a huge need for me right now. I have health insurance, all these things. Like, I don't have, like, this intimate experience with, like, the problems that face the survival needs of the community. So a huge thing is, like, making sure that community members who are most affected are the people who are guiding these campaigns, guiding the ideas and where we go. There are a lot of other movements that have guided my work, because, like, this work has been done before. Like, even though transgender advocacy is sort of in, like, it's not in its infancy, it's sort of in, like, a middle period, early middle period, but, like, there are examples all across the country and across time of not only trans advocacy that's worked elsewhere, but also, like, other types of advocacy that are just applicable, right? So first of all, I think there's a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right, by Paulo Freire. It's a really good book. It's, like, one of the manuals for, like, organizing, right? And, like, he says, like, the things that I've said so far, he says pretty much that you have to do that, right? That you have to meet the community where they are, that you have to, like, talk and get the community's needs. They express what they need, and it becomes, like, a critical dialogue between, like, the advocate and the community, so the community becomes, you know, the people who are, like, the agents of their own liberation. And, he's writing that as a Brazilian activist working in impoverished communities in Brazil, but it's totally applicable across the board, right? I mean, that's just how it works. Like, you have to, like, engage the community, get the ideas, make sure that, like, the community is really taking as much leadership as is possible. So there's that. Looking with other movements, I used to work in organized labor. And what I saw in working there was that people in government have sort of an iffy view. Like, they don't necessarily know what their job is, right? Like, their job description is not always, like, a thing that they're totally sure of. So, like, merely by forcing an issue, by suggesting that they can do something, you can probably get that thing done. Government and otherwise. I mean, like, when I was working in labor, what we always wanted to do was get contractors to stop using a company on their projects. And the way contracting works, it's like the person who runs the project, the developer, never has a direct contractual relationship with, like, the person who's, like, putting in rebar and, like, and beams and stuff, right? They don't have a contractual relationship directly. So usually they're like, oh, we don't have, it's called privity of contract. We don't have privity of contract. But there's this developer who seemed like he had a really good social conscience. So it was kind of like, we urged the issue and said, like, hey, how about on your projects, even though you don't have, like, direct contractual relationships, you still urge everybody who works on your projects not to contract with this one person. And he said, sure. Right? We gave him the evidence that this company in question was not a good company, and he went with it. And so that's not the same thing as trans activism, but what the lesson is that, like, most people say no to this idea that we have, but one person says yes. And that person said yes because we forced the issue, and we pushed really hard. And so it's sort of like, in activism, no matter what the realm, I think that, like, it really comes down to just saying, like, we think that this can happen. We know that this can happen. Do it. And then, yeah, I mean, there's just, like, really great activism across the country. For trans activism, even though DC is, like, one of, like, the marquee municipalities where, like, really cool stuff happens, like, San Francisco's always a little bit ahead of us. Portland is usually a little bit ahead of Portland, Oregon. So it's, like, looking to see what activists in Portland and San Francisco are doing. The most important thing to do is to, when it comes to trying to build community power, like, the community has to be in control. You can guide things, like, there's always a need for energy to, like, be like, hey, let's get this done. But when it comes to getting things done, people have, no matter how marginalized, people have, like, a really deep, innate sense of power. And so it's just a matter of unlocking that. And I think unlocking that is showing, like, one, paying attention to the individual and, like, an individual's needs and making sure that those are met. And then showing them that, like, you can achieve what they need. So, like, with workers, it's like, if you have workers who are getting ripped off of their money and you want to organize workers to make sure that they're doing what they need, like, get them their money back. Show them that by protesting they can get their money back. And then you start finding it's much easier to organize because you've met the individual's need and you've been able to follow it through. With trans folks, that's kind of what I'm looking at right now. It's like, I know people with specific individual healthcare needs. And so I want to try and meet those individuals' needs while being able to apply the meeting of that need to the community's larger needs. So you need to focus on the individual, show what they can do to accomplish what they need, and then that can unlock a power that is just the most incredible thing that I have seen in my 26 years of life.